Today, Four-Legged Loyalty brings you a story set in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, USA, a place where lush green pine forests stretch endlessly, dense fog covers the winding trails, and secrets are hidden beneath the mist waiting to be discovered. This is Calling in the Mist, the secret of a German shepherd, a story of simple friendship, steadfast loyalty, and a strange secret revealed through the journey of Sergeant Daniel Dan Harper and his dog Shadow. Daniel Dan Harper is a 35-year-old sergeant in the U.S. Army, stationed at a temporary base near the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 50 miles southeast of Asheville. He wasn't the most striking soldier in the unit, 5 feet 11 inches tall, built but not overly muscular, with short black hair cut in a military style and thoughtful brown eyes that hid thoughts he never shared. His face was tanned from days spent on patrol, with faint lines at the corners of his eyes, marks from hiking the rugged trails of the Blue Ridge and sleeping outdoors in the pines. Dan came from a small town called Black Mountain, near Asheville, where foggy mornings shrouding the mountains, birds chirping in the woods, and small streams running through the valleys had shaped his childhood. His family lived in a small log house with a gray tile roof, peeling white paint on the wooded walls, and an old fireplace that his father, Thomas Harper, used to stoke on cold winter nights. Dan was the youngest of 3 children. He grew up in the pine forests near Black Mountain, jogging on dirt roads in his old sneakers and his father's brown jacket, letting the winter chill and autumn mist seep into his skin. He was not a good communicator, preferring the quiet of nature to the noisy chatter of the town. When he turned 18, he graduated from Black Mountain High and found himself at a crossroads in his life. His older brother Michael had moved to Raleigh to become an engineer, and his older sister Emily had stayed in Black Mountain to teach elementary school. But Dan didn't want to stay. He felt the town was too small, too familiar, and he yearned for a greater purpose. His father, a former lumberjack, often told stories of his days working in the pines, of the patience and perseverance the outdoors had taught him, and those stories planted a seed in Dan's mind. He wanted to test himself in a harsher environment. One winter afternoon, while jogging through the woods near Black Mountain, Dan saw a recruitment poster hanging in the town post office. "Join the Army, try your best." The words clicked in his mind, and a few weeks later, he packed his father's old backpack, a brown one with frayed straps, a few changes of clothing, and his father's small folding knife, and headed to the recruiting center in Asheville. When he arrived at Fort Bragg in 2010, Dan trained to be a patrol and explosive ordnance disposal specialist, a role that required focus and patience, qualities he had learned from his days jogging through the pine forests of Black Mountain. Fort Bragg is a vast area, with red dirt training grounds, pine forests, and days of scorching sun and occasional rain. Dan wore an olive green uniform, a cap, and carried an M4 rifle, but he wasn't the best soldier on the team. He didn't have the speed of his younger comrades, nor the shooting skills that would have propelled him to the top. But Dan had one thing no one could deny: perseverance. He could hike for hours on rugged trails without complaining, and sit still on cold nights observing without losing focus. He carried his father's folding knife in his pocket, not for protection, but as a reminder of Black Mountain, of the days he thought he would never leave. Shadow entered Dan's life one morning in May 2022, more than a decade into his tenure at Fort Bragg. Shadow was a German shepherd transferred from the training center in Lackland, Texas, where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Shadow was not the largest of his litter, weighing in at 82 pounds and standing nearly 27 inches from shoulder to paw, but he stood out for his alertness and his ability to detect explosives. Shadow's coat was jet black with a hint of brown on his legs and chest, groomed to withstand the chill of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the dense fog that hung off the trails. His ears were always upright, alert to every sound, from the wind whistling through the pine trees to the distant hum of an engine. His bright brown eyes had an uncanny sharpness, as if they could see through the fog and see things that humans couldn't. Shadow was trained to detect explosives and patrol, a vital task in areas like the Blue Ridge, where rugged terrain and harsh weather often concealed hidden dangers. The first time Dan met Shadow, he was standing in the Fort Bragg training yard, in the weak light of a spring morning. The training yard was a large area, surrounded by wire fencing and pine forests, with the ground covered in dry grass and red soil typical of North Carolina. Shadow was led from the kennel by a trainer named Rachel, a woman in her mid-30s with neatly tied blonde hair and hands strong from years of working with dogs. Rachel wore an olive green military shirt, placed a black nylon collar around Shadow's neck, and told Dan that Shadow was a special dog, capable of detecting explosives at a greater distance than any other dog in his litter. Dan looked at Shadow, sensing the wariness in the dog's eyes. He took his time. He walked slowly, kneeling about 3 feet away from Shadow, and placed his hand on its head. Dan's hand trembled, not because of fear, but because he felt a strange connection. Shadow sniffed his hand, tilted his head, and then sat down suddenly, his eyes looking straight at Dan as if accepting him from that moment on. Rachel smiled, patted Dan on the shoulder, and told him that he was Shadow's chosen one. From then on, Dan and Shadow became an inseparable pair. Every morning, as the dawn broke through the pine trees, Dan took Shadow on patrol around the area, checking the trails leading into the temporary base at Blue Ridge. He would throw an old rubber ball, a ball that was frayed and covered in red dirt, for Shadow to chase, watching it run with strong strides, its muscles clearly visible under its jet black fur. There were days when Dan sat on a wooden bench in the camp, reading an old book like To Kill a Mockingbird or jotting down random thoughts in a small notebook, and Shadow would lie down next to him, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed but alert. Dan didn't say much, but he would whisper short sentences to Shadow. "You did great today," or "You're my best friend, you know that?" He didn't know if Shadow understood what he said, but every time he spoke, Shadow would raise his head and look at him with eyes that were shining brightly, as if he wanted to respond. To Dan, Shadow was more than just a working dog. He was a companion, a part of the family he had never seen since leaving Black Mountain. There were nights when Dan lay in his bunk in the camp, a small room with wooden walls, a folding bed, and an old desk. He thought back to his childhood, to morning jogs through the pine woods, the sound of dew falling from the leaves, or sitting by the fire with his father, the smell of wood smoke in the air. He had left home in search of a purpose, but every time he looked down at Shadow, curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, breathing steadily, he felt comforted. Shadow was more than just a dog. He was the reason Dan kept going, the reason he believed there was something worth living for. The story that Four-Legged Loyalty wants to tell today is not only about Dan and Shadow, but also about an unexpected challenge that tested their loyalty and revealed a secret hidden in the fog. It took place on a January morning in 2025, when Dan and Shadow were sent to Blue Ridge to assist in the search for a missing military plane in thick fog. The mission seemed simple: patrol the pine forest to find traces of the plane. But an unexpected fall left Dan missing, and Shadow, with unwavering loyalty, stayed behind to find him, leading to a strange discovery in the fog. This is not a fictional story. It is told from military reports, from the accounts of those on the patrol, and from the scribbles Dan wrote in his notebook after his recovery. This is Calling in the Mist, the secret of a German shepherd. Dan Harper isn't a big talker, and if someone asks him where he's from or why he joined the military, he'll usually just say, Black Mountain. Wanted to be challenged. But behind that reticence lies a long story about growing up in Black Mountain, a small town near Asheville, North Carolina, where foggy mornings shrouding the mountains, birds chirping in the pine forests, and small streams running through the valleys defined his childhood. Black Mountain wasn't a place where people dreamed of great success. It was a place where people lived slowly, worked hard, and rarely left to find a different life. Dan grew up in a working-class family, not rich but not destitute either. His father, Thomas Harper, was a lumberjack with rough hands, blackened by turpentine, and brown hair that had turned gray at the temples from years of outdoor labor. His mother, Clara, was a gentle woman who worked at a small grocery store in the center of town, where she stood behind the counter, selling cartons of milk, bread, and household goods to the locals. Dan was the youngest of 3 children. He grew up in the pine forests near Black Mountain, jogging down the dirt roads in his father's old sneakers and brown jacket, letting the winter chill and autumn fog seep into his skin. He was not a great student at Black Mountain High, but he was always persistent. He liked to run alone through the pine forests, listening to the wind whistling through the trees, the smell of pine and damp earth filling his nostrils. He didn't attend the weekend soccer games or rallies that the kids at Black Mountain loved. He just ran, thought, and searched for some meaning in life that he couldn't quite figure out. His older brother, Michael, had always been the smartest, doing well in school and later moving to Raleigh to work as an electrical engineer. His older sister, Emily, was gentle and patient, choosing to stay in Black Mountain to teach, living a quiet life among the mountains she loved. But Dan was different. He didn't want a life that was too safe, too familiar. When he was 18, Dan was at a crossroads in his life. He had just graduated from high school, but he had no plans to go to college like Michael or stay in Black Mountain like Emily. His father often told him about his days as a lumberjack, about the miles he'd spent walking through the pine forest to cut down trees, about the patience nature taught him as he waited for the rains to stop or the streams to recede. These stories weren't just memories of his father. They instilled in Dan a desire to test himself in a harsher environment, where he could test his limits. His mother, Clara, was concerned that he had no clear direction, but she didn't discourage him. She quietly prepared a dinner of roast beef and mashed potatoes, his favorite, and placed a clean handkerchief in his backpack before he left. One winter afternoon, while jogging through the woods near Black Mountain, Dan stopped at the town post office and saw a recruitment poster hanging on the wall: "Join the Army, try your best." The words lit a small fire in his mind, awakening the desire for purpose that he had cherished since childhood. A few weeks later, Dan packed his father's old backpack, a brown one frayed at the straps, containing a few changes of clothes, his father's small folding knife, and a family photo taken by the creek near their house, and headed to the recruiting center in Asheville. He didn't say much as he left Black Mountain. He stood in front of the cabin, took one last look at it, felt the winter chill seep through his jacket, and walked away without looking back. When he arrived at Fort Bragg in 2010, Dan trained as an explosive ordnance disposal patrolman, a role that required focus and patience, qualities he'd learned from running through the pine forests of Black Mountain. Fort Bragg was a vast area, with red dirt training grounds, pine forests, and scorching sun and occasional rain. He wore an olive green uniform, a cap, and carried an M4 rifle, but he wasn't the best soldier on the team. He wasn't as agile as his younger comrades, nor did he have the shooting skills to quickly advance through the ranks. But Dan had one thing no one could deny: perseverance. He could hike for hours on rugged trails without complaining, and he could sit still on cold nights to observe without losing focus. He carried his father's folding knife in his pocket, not for protection, but as a reminder of Black Mountain, of the days he thought he would never leave. Shadow came into Dan's life one morning in May 2022, more than a decade after he'd been at Fort Bragg. Shadow was a German Shepherd transferred from the training center in Lackland, Texas, where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Shadow was not the largest dog in his litter, weighing in at 82 pounds and standing nearly 27 inches from paw to shoulder, but he stood out for his alertness and his ability to detect explosives. Shadow's coat was jet black with a hint of brown on his legs and chest, groomed to withstand the chill of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the dense fog that hung from the trails. His ears were always erect, alert to every sound, from the wind whistling through the pine trees to the distant hum of an engine. His bright brown eyes had an uncanny sharpness, as if they could see through the fog and see things that humans couldn't. Shadow was trained to detect explosives and patrol, a vital task in areas like the Blue Ridge, where the rugged terrain and inclement weather often concealed hidden dangers. The first time Dan met Shadow, he was standing in the Fort Bragg training yard in the weak light of a spring morning. The training grounds were a large area, surrounded by wire fencing and pine forests, with the ground covered in dry grass and the red soil typical of North Carolina. Shadow was led from the kennel by a trainer named Rachel, a woman of about 36 with neatly tied blonde hair and hands strong from years of working with service dogs. Rachel wore an olive green military shirt, placed a black nylon collar around Shadow's neck, and told Dan that Shadow was a special dog with the ability to detect explosives at a greater distance than any dog in his litter. Dan looked at Shadow, sensing the wariness in the dog's eyes. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, knelt down about 3 feet in front of Shadow, and placed his hand on the dog's head. Dan's hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from a strange sense of connection. Shadow sniffed his hand, tilted his head, and then suddenly sat down, his eyes fixed on Dan as if accepting him from that moment. Rachel smiled, patted Dan on the shoulder, and said that he was Shadow's choice. From then on, Dan and Shadow became an inseparable pair. Every morning, as the dawn broke through the pine trees, Dan took Shadow on patrol around the area, checking the trails leading to the temporary base at Blue Ridge. He would throw an old rubber ball, a ball that was frayed and covered in red dirt, for Shadow to chase, watching it run with strong steps, its muscles clearly visible under its jet black fur. There were days when Dan sat on a wooden bench in the camp, reading a book or writing something in his notebook. Shadow would lie down next to him, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed but still alert. Dan didn't say much, but he would whisper short sentences to Shadow. "You were great at finding your way today," or "You're my best friend, you know that?" He didn't know if Shadow understood those words or not, but every time he spoke, Shadow raised his head, looking at him with shining eyes, as if wanting to respond. To Dan, Shadow was more than a working dog. He was a companion, a part of the family he had left behind when he left Black Mountain. There were nights when Dan lay in his bunk, a small room with wooden walls, a folding bed, and an old desk. He thought about his parents, about his childhood, and felt a hollow loneliness. He remembered morning runs through the pine woods, listening to the dew falling from the leaves, or sitting by the fire with his father, the smell of wood smoke in the air. But every time he looked down at Shadow, curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, breathing steadily, he felt comforted. Shadow was more than a dog. He was the reason Dan kept going, the reason he believed there was something worth living for. One January morning in 2025, Dan Harper, and Shadow are sent to a temporary base in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina to assist in an urgent mission, searching for a military plane that went missing in dense fog after sending out a distress call. The mission is not typical for Dan's unit. They usually patrol the trails around the area, looking for explosives or securing small bases nestled in lush pine forests. But as Dan stands in the base's courtyard, watching the jeeps lined up in preparation for departure, he feels a vague unease creeping in. Perhaps it's the chill of the winter morning, when the temperature outside is only 2 degrees Celsius 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and the thick fog carries the scent of pine resin and damp earth from the surrounding forests. Or maybe it was the look in Shadow's eyes, the German shepherd who always walked beside him. As he lifted his head to look at him, his ears pricked as if sensing something in the mist he couldn't see. Dan wore an olive green uniform, designed to blend into the forest landscape, with a thick windproof jacket, moisture-wicking trousers, and brown leather boots covered in dry dirt from past patrols. He wore an olive green cap, the brim frayed from sweat and dew, and a pair of small goggles to protect his eyes from branches and the cold wind that blew across the trails. Over his shoulder, he carried a small backpack containing the essentials: a scuffed plastic water bottle, a pack of dry rations, a small first aid kit with bandages and antiseptic, a high-powered flashlight, and the notebook he kept with him, where he jotted down his scattered thoughts about life in the Blue Ridge. At his side was an M4 rifle, the sling frayed at the edges. But he was not a soldier who relied on weapons. He relied more on patience and observation than bullets. Dan was not a showman. He did not carry the fancy gadgets of some of his comrades, who favored GPS watches and rangefinders, because for him simplicity was a way to keep his mind focused. Shadow, as always, walked beside Dan. The 82-pound German shepherd had a coat of jet black with a hint of brown on his legs and chest, carefully groomed against the chill of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the dense fog that hung from the trails. Shadow wore a black nylon collar with a small metal tag bearing his military identification number, S5281. Shadow's ears were erect, his bright brown eyes were alert, and his steps were strong and sure as he walked across the dry pine needles of the base yard. Dan looked at Shadow, feeling a strange comfort. He knew that Shadow was more than just a working dog. He was his second set of eyes and ears, a creature that could detect things that humans couldn't, especially in a place like the Blue Ridge, where every step could lead to a surprise hidden in the mist. Before getting into the car, Dan knelt down and stroked Shadow's head, feeling the dry but soft fur under his hand, red dirt from previous patrols. He didn't think much of it, but he felt that having Shadow by his side was enough to face whatever was coming. Dan's patrol consisted of 6 men, all experienced soldiers, trained to face the dangers of the deep mountains. The team was led by Captain Mark Reynolds, a 40-year-old man with short gray hair, a lean face tanned by time spent outdoors, and piercing blue eyes that watched everything with caution. Reynolds was stern but dedicated, always putting the mission first, and he had a leadership style that inspired confidence, though he was sometimes so focused on the goal that he forgot about the feelings of his teammates. The other members of the team included Corporal Chris Evans, a tall, dark-haired, quiet 29-year-old who was a map reader, Private First Class Sarah Gwynn, a petite but agile 24-year-old woman who specialized in communications, and 3 other soldiers, James Carter, Anna Lee, and Tom Brooks, all in their 30s, specializing in survival techniques and explosives disposal. The team was fully equipped: paper maps, handheld signal detectors, walkie-talkies, flashlights, and some survival items such as drinking water, dry food, and a small tarp to use if they had to stay overnight. The trip began around 7 a.m., when the sun was just peeking through the pine trees, but the light was obscured by a thick fog that kept the area in darkness. The team traveled in 2 military jeeps, olive green vehicles with large tires designed to handle the rugged terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Dan sat in the back seat of the first vehicle, next to Sarah, while Shadow curled up at his feet, his head resting on his paws, his ears perked up as the road went over the bumps. The road from the base to the mission's starting point was a long one, through pine forests with green and yellow leaves, past small streams that trickled through the mist, and through trails covered in red dirt and dry pine needles. Dan looked out the window, saw the dew on the pine needles glistening faintly in the dim light, and his unease grew more pronounced. He didn't know why he felt that way, but he tried to push it aside, telling himself that this was just a routine search mission. When the team reached the mission's starting point, a clearing about 8 miles from the base, near a small stream with a slow trickle of water under a blanket of fog, they got out of their vehicles and began to prepare. Their mission was to patrol a 9-mile stretch of forest in the Blue Ridge Mountains, looking for signs of the missing military aircraft, the UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter that had sent out a distress call before losing contact 2 days earlier. Reynolds stood in front of the team, map in hand, and explained the plan. We're going to walk through the area, checking every inch of it for signs of the plane. Shadow will go ahead to look for anything unusual. The fog is thick, visibility is poor, so keep a tight formation and stay in constant radio contact. If there's any sign of trouble, retreat to the vehicle. Dan listened, nodding, but he couldn't shake the feeling of worry. He looked down at Shadow, who stood still, his ears pricked higher, as if sniffing the foggy air. The team set out around 7:30 a.m. Dry pine needles rustled under Dan's boots as they left the clearing, and the morning chill seeped through his jacket, making him shiver. The temperature was about 1 degree Celsius, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ground was damp from the fog that had not yet lifted. Dan walked near the front of the team, with Shadow as usual. He walked at a steady pace, his boots leaving faint footprints in the dry leaves, quickly covered by the dew. Shadow walked beside him, his nose sniffing the ground constantly, his eyes alert, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air as if searching for something. The team moved in silence, the only sound being their footsteps and steady breathing in the silence of the deep forest. Dan could feel sweat beginning to seep through his undershirt, even though the air was still cold, and he knew it was a sign of his inner tension. As the team moved deeper into the Blue Ridge Mountains, the landscape became wilder. The trail led through pine forests with green and yellow leaves, with dense bushes and moss-covered rocks scattered on both sides. The tall pines grew densely, casting patchy shadows on the ground, and the thick fog reduced visibility to just a few meters. Dan looked up at the sky through the gaps in the canopy, but saw only a white mist, not a ray of sunlight penetrating. He turned to look at Shadow, who paused for a moment, his head raised, ears pricked higher, his nose sniffing the moist air. He thought to himself that Shadow must have sensed something was wrong too, but he wasn't sure what. Around 8 o'clock, when the team had gone nearly 2 miles, they entered a narrower section of the trail, flanked by low slopes, about 6 feet high, covered with dry pine needles and loose rocks. The path was less than 4 feet wide, and the ground was slippery with wet leaves and tangled roots. Dan felt the chill grow more acute, as if the air were trapped between the slopes, and a suffocating feeling began to rise in his stomach. He looked at Shadow, who was more focused than ever, his nose sniffing the ground, his ears pricked to the max. He felt a greater unease than ever, but he didn't have time to think about it. Little did he know that in just a few minutes, a sudden cold wind would blow through, carrying a strange sound, and his life would change forever. As Dan Harper's patrol pushed deeper into the narrow trail between the low slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the chill of the January morning was still all around. The temperature hovered around 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius, and a thick fog carried the scent of pine resin and damp earth through the canopy of pine trees that were green and yellow. The trail, less than 4 feet wide, was slippery with dry pine needles and tangled roots, forcing Dan to tread carefully with each step. He wore an olive green uniform, a thick windproof jacket that had absorbed some of the dew from the air, moisture-wicking pants caked with red dirt, and brown leather boots that left faint footprints in the dry leaves. Sweat was beginning to seep through his undershirt, and even though the temperature was still cold, he felt a little stifled under his frayed cap. A small backpack on his shoulder held a flashlight, a map, and a notebook, and the M4 rifle hung from his waist, the strap rubbing against his neck as he moved. But he paid it no mind. The unease in his heart outweighed any discomfort from the gear or the weather. Dan walked near the front of the team, with Shadow, his trusty German Shepherd companion. Shadow walked with sure steps, his jet-black fur streaked with dry leaves and red dirt from the road, but his erect ears and bright brown eyes still gleamed with constant alertness. Shadow's black nylon collar, with its metal tag bearing the number 5281, vibrated as he moved, and his nose sniffed the ground constantly, searching for any sign of danger. Dan looked at Shadow, feeling a small comfort amid the cold and the growing tension inside him. He knew that Shadow was more than just a working dog. It was his second set of eyes and ears, a creature that could detect things that humans couldn't, especially in the dense fog of the Blue Ridge. But even Shadow's presence couldn't completely dispel the uneasy feeling he'd carried since leaving the base, a feeling that something was waiting for them ahead, hidden beneath the pine trees and the milky mist. The patrol had gone nearly 2 miles since leaving the clearing, and the narrow trail they were entering was a narrow path, flanked by low slopes, about 6 feet high, with a surface of dry pine needles, wet red dirt, and loose rocks. The ground beneath Dan's feet was slippery, with small stones rolling under his shoes, and the wet leaves made a treacherous carpet, hiding the bumps beneath. The tight space made Dan feel claustrophobic, as if the slopes were closing in around him, and the cold from the ground seeped through his uniform, making him shiver. He looked up through the gaps in the canopy, but saw only a white mist, through which no sunlight could penetrate. He turned to look at Shadow, who paused for a moment, raising his head to sniff the air. His ears pricked higher, as detecting something unusual. Dan felt his heart beat faster, but he had no time to think about it. Only seconds later, as the team advanced a few steps into the narrow path, a cold wind blew suddenly from deep in the woods, carrying an eerie whistle like a distant whisper. The thick fog swirled around them, momentarily obscuring their vision, turning the landscape around them into a hazy world where the pines were only vague silhouettes and the wild bushes disappeared into the white mist. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping to around 0 degrees Celsius 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ground was more slippery than ever as dew formed into droplets on the pine needles. Dan felt his breath hitch, not from the cold, but from the suddenness of the situation. He slowed, raising his hand to test his distance from Shadow, but in that moment, his foot slipped on a layer of wet leaves covering the rocks. He fell forward, his balance lost, and in his attempt to cling to the slope beside him, he failed to notice a narrow crevice hidden beneath the pine needles and rocks. He fell into the crevice about 4 meters, 13 feet, deep, a natural pit created by years of rain erosion, now covered with red soil and tangled tree roots. Dan hit his right foot hard on a sharp rock inside the crevice, heard a dry snap, and his head hit a dry log, drawing blood from a gash on his forehead. He passed out instantly, his body lying motionless in the darkness of the ravine, his small backpack torn open at one corner, and his walkie-talkie shattered on the damp ground. Shadow, who was fortunately a few steps ahead of Dan, was not affected by the fall, but the dog barked frantically when he realized that Dan had disappeared into the thick fog. Shadow's bark echoed through the deep mountains, full of panic and despair, as if he was calling Dan back. The dog ran to the edge of the ravine, claws scratching at the damp red soil and wet leaves, trying to dig down to find him, but the landslide and tangled roots prevented it. Shadow scratched relentlessly, leaving scratches on the soil, but it could not penetrate. Shadow's bright brown eyes were red from the dew and cold wind, and its jet black fur was damp from the humid air, but it did not care. In its mind, there was only one goal: to find Dan. The patrol, divided by the cold wind and thick fog, fell into chaos. The wind not only obscured their vision but also disoriented them, making it impossible to accurately determine each other's location. Captain Mark Reynolds, the team leader, was about 8 feet away from Dan when he fell, but the thick fog made it impossible to see anything but the faint outlines of his teammates. He shouted into his radio, his voice broken by the wind and the falling mist. "Harper, where are you? Report now." But there was no response. Dan's radio in his backpack had shattered when he fell, and the signal was gone. Reynolds turned to see the other members of the team, Chris Evans, Sarah Nguyen, and the rest, striving to regroup in the fog, their hands clutching their rifles, their eyes alert for any sound around them. Shadow continued to bark, his bark echoing in the crevices, but no one on the team could get close enough to check. The fog was so thick they could see only a few feet ahead, and the slippery ground made every step a risk. Reynolds knew it was too dangerous to stay here, not only because of the fog, but also because of the treacherous terrain and the possibility of getting stuck in inclement weather. He radioed orders: retreat to the car immediately. Call for backup on signal. The team began to move back down the trail, keeping a tight formation to avoid getting lost, but Shadow refused to follow. Sarah Nguyen, the closest to Shadow, ran up, grabbed the dog's nylon collar, and tried to pull him away. But Shadow growled, yanked on the leash, and ran back to the edge of the ravine, barking incessantly. Reynolds looked at Shadow, saw the dog's determined gaze, but he had no choice. He ordered the team to retreat without Shadow, knowing they needed to survive to call for help. The team left the area, leaving Shadow alone in the fog and cold, with the wind whistling through the trees and the distant sound of running water in the deep woods. Dan lay unconscious in the narrow crevice, his body shaking from the trauma, blood from the gash on his forehead running down his cheek, drying in red streaks on his tanned skin. He didn't know that the team had retreated, didn't know that the mist and cold wind were covering the Blue Ridge Mountains above, and didn't know that Shadow was at the edge of the crevice, determined not to leave. In the darkness of the crevice, a small gap between the rock and the earth allowed mist to seep in, carrying a bit of moisture from the air, keeping him breathing, albeit feebly. His backpack lay scattered beside him, his notebook out, open to the last page he'd written, "This morning, thick fog, cold." He didn't have the strength to wake up, didn't have the strength to call out to Shadow. But in his daze, he thought vaguely of the dog, hoping that Shadow was safe with the team. On the ground, Shadow didn't care about the cold or the thick fog. It stood at the edge of the ravine, claws digging into the wet red earth, leaving deep scratches that it could not dig through. Its barks were getting weaker as the cold dried its throat, but it did not stop. Shadow knew that Dan was down there, and it would not leave until it found him. Its fur was damp with dew, its eyes red from wind and fatigue, but its gaze was steady, as if to say it would never give up. Shadow stood there, alone in the depths of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in the mist and the cold, waiting, against all odds, as a testament to its loyalty to Dan, a loyalty that would lead to a strange secret in the days to come. After Dan Harper fell into a narrow ravine in a sudden cold windstorm in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the patrol was forced to retreat, leaving Shadow, the faithful German shepherd, alone in the thick fog and damp cold. The fog did not clear immediately after the team left. It remained in a white blanket, obscuring the outlines of the lush green and yellow pine trees, the dense underbrush, and the slippery trail the team had just traversed. The daytime temperature hovered around 0 degrees Celsius 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the chill air carried the scent of pine resin and damp red earth, drowned out by the soft whistling of the wind. Shadow stood at the edge of the ravine where Dan had disappeared, his ears erect, his bright brown eyes now red from the fog and wind, but his gaze unwavering. He barked incessantly, echoing through the trees, weakened by his parched throat, but Shadow did not care. In its mind, there was only one goal: to find Dan, the companion it had chosen to be faithful to since the day they first met. 2 days had passed since Dan had fallen, and Shadow had remained at the edge of the ravine, braving the cold of the day and the bitter cold of the night when the temperature dropped to -2 degrees Celsius 28 degrees Fahrenheit, making its body shiver under its wet fur. The Blue Ridge Mountains were unforgiving to any living creature, and Shadow had no water or food to sustain him other than the dew it licked from the pine needles. Its jet-black fur, once carefully groomed to protect against the cold of the mountains and the mist from the trails, was now matted with red dirt and dry leaves, matted in patches, exposing the emaciated body beneath. Its ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched from hitting a tree root in its relentless digging efforts. The bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red and dim from the frost, the cold, and exhaustion, but they still stared at the dirt covering the crevice, as if they could see through it to see Dan below. Shadow clawed at the ground, leaving deep scratches in the damp red earth and tangled roots, sometimes bleeding where his claws made contact with sharp rocks hidden beneath the surface. He tried to dig through more than 2 feet of dirt to reach Dan, but the cold hardened the ground, and each time Shadow dug a little, the mist condensed into water, filling his efforts. Shadow did not give up. He stopped, panting, his breath forming tiny clouds in the cold air, then clawed again, as if driven by some deep instinct, an instinct of absolute loyalty to Dan. Its legs trembled with cold and exhaustion. The lean muscles that had once propelled it along the trails around the base now shriveled from lack of water and nourishment. Shadow ate nothing but a few dry pine needles it accidentally swallowed while sniffing the ground, and it drank nothing but the dew on the leaves. Its red eyes stared at the dirt, and its barks grew weaker by the day, drowned out by the wind whistling through the trees in the deep forest. But Shadow didn't care about hunger, thirst, or the cold that was slowly robbing it of its life. It only knew that Dan was down there, and it had to stay to save him. Dan lay in the suffocating darkness below, his body immobile from the terrible fall from the cold wind. He woke up after a few hours of unconsciousness, his mind hazy, not knowing how long he had been there. The sharp pain from his broken right leg spread throughout his body, and every time he tried to move, he had to grit his teeth to keep from screaming in pain. A gash on his forehead, where he had hit a dry log when he fell, left dried blood streaking his tanned face, and his brown eyes were blurred with dehydration and exhaustion. The temperature in the crevice was slightly cooler than outside, around -1 degree Celsius 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but the stifling, oxygen-deprived air made it difficult for him to breathe. He survived because of a small gap between the rock and the earth, where mist seeped in, carrying moisture from the surface air. He licked small drops of water from the rock, taking weak sips to keep himself from becoming completely dehydrated, but he knew that if he did not get help soon, he would not last much longer. In those dreamy hours, Dan thought about Shadow. He remembered mornings at the base near Blue Ridge, throwing an old rubber ball for Shadow to chase across the training grounds, watching the dog run with strong strides, his muscles defined by his black fur covered in red dirt. He remembered nights in the camp, Shadow curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, his ears perked up as he whispered to him about his days at Black Mountain. He remembered the way Shadow's eyes glowed when he looked at him, as if the dog understood everything he didn't say. He wondered if Shadow was safe, if he'd followed the patrol to find shelter, or if he was still somewhere on the ground, waiting for him. He didn't know that Shadow was right above him, just a few feet away, but the dirt was thick. He whispered to himself with the last of his strength, "Shadow, where are you? If you're still alive, find me." But he didn't have the strength to shout, and his voice was drowned out by the oppressive silence in the ravine. On the ground, Shadow faced the cold, the fog, and the loneliness of the deep mountains. A few times, there was a distant noise, maybe a deer moving in the bushes or an owl hoot in the night, but Shadow paid no attention to those dangers. He didn't think about hunger, thirst, or the cold that was slowly robbing him of his life. In his mind, there was only Dan the soldier who had knelt down and stroked his head when they first met, who had shared their cold patrols in the mountains, who had become his family in this strange land. Shadow lay down on the edge of the ravine when the cold of the day became too much, curling up to keep some of his own warmth during the cold nights. But within minutes, he would be back up again, scratching and barking, as if refusing to rest. About a mile and a half from the ravine, a group of locals living near a small town on the edge of the Blue Ridge heard Shadow's faint barking echoing through the cold winds after the thick fog lifted on the second day. They were familiar with the mountain, often hunting or helping with search and rescue missions during the winter to help those in need. A man named Eli, in his 50s and a former firefighter in Asheville, stood on a low slope, listening to the distant barking, but he couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from in the lingering fog. He thought it might be a stray dog, but he didn't dare venture too far into the woods, where tales of wild animals and missing people kept the locals cautious. He returned to the group's camp and sat by the small fire, but he still felt a vague unease. He didn't know that the barking was from Shadow, a dog fighting cold, thirst, and death to save his master. Dan began to lose consciousness in a narrow crevice. He felt his body growing lighter, as if he were floating in an unknown space. He no longer felt the pain of his broken leg or the oppressive cold. Everything became blurry, and his mind drifted to distant memories. He remembered mornings jogging on the dirt roads of Black Mountain, when thick fog had shrouded the mountains, blurring them into a picture. He remembered sitting by the fire with his father, listening to the crackling of the firewood and the smell of wood smoke in the air. He remembered the mornings in Blue Ridge when he and Shadow would patrol the base, the peace of watching the dog run along the pine needle-covered trails. He thought that if he were to die here, at least he would have had those moments when he felt his life had meaning. But he didn't want to give up. "Shadow, if you're still there, find me," he whispered to himself. "I trust you." On the ground, Shadow did not know that Dan was losing hope. He did not know that the patrol had retreated, that the fog still covered the deep mountains, that no one could hear his barks over the whistling wind and rustling leaves. But Shadow did not need to know. He did not act on reason or logic. He acted on instinct, on the loyalty that was deep in the heart of a German shepherd. Shadow stood there, at the edge of the narrow crevice, a lone figure in the deep woods and fog, steadfast and unyielding. He did not leave, did not give up, even though his body was exhausted, even though the cold and fog were slowly sapping his strength. Shadow knew that Dan was down there, and he would stay until he found him, or until he had no more strength left to continue. 2 days passed, and Shadow was still standing there, living testament to loyalty that transcended all limits. Little did he know that the local group would soon hear his barking, that his efforts would lead to an emotional reunion and the revelation of a strange secret. But Shadow didn't need to know that. To him, only one thing mattered: Dan, his companion, his master, the one to whom he had chosen to be loyal since the day they first met. Shadow stood there, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, waiting, hoping, and fighting, a German shepherd with a heart that would never give up. 2 days after Dan Harper fell into a narrow ravine in a sudden cold snap in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the patrol did not return immediately to look for him. Dense fog, combined with the rugged terrain and the loss of radio signals when Dan's equipment shattered in the fall, made initial efforts impossible. Daytime temperatures hovered around 0 degrees Celsius 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the damp mountain chill permeated the soil, dry pine needles, and air, carrying the scent of pine resin on the weak winds. Dan lay at the bottom of the ravine in the stifling darkness, his body immobile from the horrific fall. He had regained consciousness after several hours in a coma, but now he was drifting into a dreamlike state between life and death. The pain from his broken right leg and the laceration on his forehead had become only a dull sensation, as if his body had given up fighting back the pain. The sweat had stopped flowing because he was severely dehydrated, and his brown eyes were half closed, blurred in the darkness. His breathing was weak in thin wisps that dissipated in the cold air, and he had no strength to move or call for help. He was saved by a small gap between the rock and the earth where mist seeped in, carrying moisture from the air, but he knew his time was running out. On the ground, Shadow still stood at the edge of the narrow crevice, a lone figure in the cold mountains. 2 days had passed, and the 82-pound German Shepherd was now emaciated and exhausted, his jet-black coat matted with red dirt and dry leaves, matted in hard clumps. Shadow's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes were now red from dew, cold, and fatigue. Its legs trembled, its claws bleeding from deep scratches where it had clawed at the wet red earth for 2 days without stopping, leaving small red streaks on the ground. Shadow had no water or food but the dew on the pine needles, and it stood there, braving the cold of the day and the chill of the night, waiting for Dan. It barked incessantly, its barking growing fainter as the days passed, drowned out by the howling wind, but Shadow did not give up. It knew Dan was down there, and it would not leave until it found him. After 2 days, as the thick fog began to lift with the stronger winds and the pale morning light of the third day, the rescue team from the temporary base near Blue Ridge decided to return to the Narrows. They had not been able to act sooner, because the fog and treacherous terrain had made all previous attempts needlessly risky. But when the weather cleared, Captain Mark Reynolds, Dan's patrol leader, resolutely led the rescue team back. Reynolds, a 40-year-old man with short gray hair, a lean, tanned face, and piercing blue eyes, could not forget the unwavering look in Shadow's eyes when the dog refused to leave the narrow crevice 2 days ago. He knew that if Dan was alive, Shadow would be the key to finding him. The 9-man rescue team, equipped with 2 military jeeps, high-powered headlights, digging tools like shovels and hose, and a medical kit for emergency first aid, left the base early Tuesday morning, when the temperature was still 1 degree Celsius 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun was just breaking through the clouds, casting a pale yellow light through the lingering mist in the air. When the rescue team reached the crevice area, they saw Shadow in the distance, a small but determined figure in the narrow path. Shadow stood there, almost motionless, his legs shaking with exhaustion, his fur matted with dirt and dead leaves, and a trail of dried blood running from his claws to the ground below. Reynolds, the leader of the team, stopped and looked at Shadow with amazement and emotion. He couldn't believe that the dog had been here for 2 days, in the damp cold and thick fog, without water or food. He walked closer, knelt before Shadow, and noticed that the dog's red eyes were still shining steadily, as if pleading with him, "Dan is here. Help me." Shadow had no strength left to bark loudly, only making weak, hoarse sounds, then shuffled to the edge of the ravine, pawing at the ground with his bleeding claws as if to show the rescuers where to dig. Corporal Chris Evans, a patrolman and now part of the rescue team, stood next to Reynolds, looking at Shadow with thoughtful eyes. Evans, a tall 29-year-old with dark brown hair and a tan, had worked with Dan and Shadow on many patrols. He knew the bond between them, and he felt a pang of pain in his heart when he thought that Dan might not make it. But when he saw Shadow, he felt a glimmer of hope. He walked over, knelt down next to Shadow, and stroked his dirt-caked fur. He felt the dog's thin, trembling body beneath his hands, and he knew that Shadow had sacrificed everything to stay here, waiting for Dan if he's alive. "It's because of you, Shadow," he whispered to himself. The rescue team quickly moved into position. They brought long steel shovels, iron hose, and a handheld air blower to clear the damp red dirt that covered the entrance to the ravine. Shadow, exhausted, trudged closer to the edge of the ravine, clawing at the ground with his weak claws, as if to help. Reynolds ordered the team to concentrate on digging in the area Shadow had indicated, where the ground bore deep scratches from the dog's claws. He knew that Shadow would not be there for nothing. If Dan were alive, he would be down there. The rescuers worked in silence, the only sounds being the shovels digging into the ground, the picks breaking through the roots, and their labored breathing in the cold air. Shadow stood by, his legs shaking, but he did not move. He looked at the rescuers with a steady gaze, as if pleading with them, "Hurry. He needs us." Dan, down in the ravine, had no idea that the rescuers had arrived. He had lost track of time, and his body was in critical condition. The temperature in the ravine was about -1 degree Celsius 30 degrees Fahrenheit, lower than outside, but the stuffy, oxygen-starved air left him with only weak breaths. He licked the small drops of water that had seeped through the cracks, drinking to keep his body from becoming completely dehydrated, but he had no strength to eat or move. His backpack torn apart when he fell, lay beside him, and his notebook fell out, open to the last page he had written. Thick, cold fog this morning. He had no strength to hold a pen, but he thought of Shadow, of the way his dog's eyes glowed whenever he looked at him, and told himself that if Shadow were alive, he would not abandon him. Little did he know that Shadow was right above him, leading the rescue team to him. The rescue team worked tirelessly for more than an hour in the cold morning. They dug through the damp red soil, breaking through the tangled roots, and finally found a narrow slit leading down into the ravine. Reynolds bent down, shining a high-powered flashlight inside, and the light from the flashlight illuminated Dan's pale face. He lay there, motionless, eyes half closed, breathing barely visible, with dried blood on his forehead and his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. Reynolds felt his heart sink, but he refused to give up hope. "We found him. Hurry," he shouted to the team, clearing the entrance with shovels in their bare hands, creating a path large enough to pull Dan up. Shadow, exhausted, trudged closer, peering down the gap with a glint in his eye. He had no strength left to bark, but he stood there waiting as if he knew Dan was about to be rescued. Sarah and Gwen, and a paramedic named Paul, a man in his mid-30s with short black hair and strong arms, climbed down the ravine to check on Dan. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket and checked his pulse and breathing. Paul placed his hand on Dan's neck, felt a faint pulse, and confirmed that he was alive, though in critical condition. "He's alive, but he's weak," he told Sarah. "We need to get him out now." They carefully placed Dan on a stretcher, strapping in place to avoid further injury. When Dan was pulled to the surface, the faint light of the sun filtering through the clouds illuminated his pale face, and the rescuers breathed a sigh of relief. He was alive, a miracle after 2 days trapped in the narrow ravine in the cold and fog of the Blue Ridge. Shadow shuffled over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff Dan's face, his red eyes shining faintly but hopefully. Shadow had no strength left to do anything more, but he was still there by Dan's side, as if to make sure he was still alive. Reynolds looked at Shadow with awe and emotion. He knelt down beside the dog, stroking its matted fur, feeling its trembling body beneath his hands. He knew that without Shadow, they would never have found Dan in time. "You are a true warrior, Shadow," he whispered to himself. Sarah wiped the mist from her face, not to clean it, but to hide the tears of emotion. She looked at Shadow, saw his emaciated body, his shaking legs, and his bleeding claws, and knew that the dog had sacrificed everything to save Dan. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Shadow. You did the unthinkable." The rescue team quickly treated Dan on the spot. Paul administered fluids through and for, pumping warm saline solution to help his body fight dehydration. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had a broken right leg and a deep laceration on his forehead, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his right leg to stabilize it temporarily and wrapped a thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the cold. Dan was still unconscious, but his breathing was gradually steadier, and his pulse was becoming more noticeable. The rescue team knew they needed to get him back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. As the rescue team prepared to load Dan into the jeep to head back to base, Shadow trailed behind, never leaving Dan's side. The dog was so exhausted he could barely walk, but he kept trying, his legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood in the dirt. Sarah looked at Shadow, feeling a pang of pain in her heart. She knew that Shadow needed medical attention, but she also knew that he wouldn't leave Dan until he was safe. Reynolds ordered the team, "Take Shadow with you. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Shadow had done his job, not with strength or skill, but with loyalty beyond measure. 2 days after Dan Harper fell into a narrow canyon in a sudden cold snap in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a rescue team from a nearby makeshift base camp returned with a glimmer of hope that he was still alive. The dense fog had cleared by Tuesday morning, giving way to a weak sunlight through thick clouds, but the damp chill of the January morning still hung over the area, with temperatures hovering around 1 degree Celsius 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The air smelled of pine resin and red earth, carried by a light wind that whistled through the green and yellow pine trees. The 9-man rescue team, equipped with military jeeps, digging tools such as shovels and hose and high-powered headlights, worked tirelessly for more than an hour to break up the damp red earth that covered the entrance to the canyon where Dan was trapped. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale yellow light through the gaps in the clouds, glinting off the dew on the dry pine needles, but not enough to dispel the chill that permeated the team's every breath. Shadow, the German shepherd who had been standing guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days, was exhausted, his lean body shivering in the damp chill. His jet-black coat, once carefully groomed against the chill of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was matted with red dirt and dry leaves, matted in hard, dry patches, revealing the prominent veins on his once lean body. Shadow's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red from the dew, the cold, and exhaustion. His legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches where he had scratched the wet red dirt for 2 days without rest, leaving small red streaks on the ground. Shadow stood there, almost motionless, but his eyes never left the rescue team, as if waiting for a miracle. He had no strength left to bark loudly, only weak, hoarse sounds, but he still trudged closer to the edge of the ravine, pawing at the ground with his claws as if to help, though each movement was an effort beyond his physical limits. Captain Mark Reynolds, the rescue team leader, stood near Shadow, watching the team work with a mixture of tension and hope. Reynolds, a 40-year-old man with short gray hair, a lean outdoor face tanned by long hours, and piercing blue eyes, had seen much loss in his years in the military. He was not an emotional man, but the sight of Shadow standing guard for 2 days without food or water, in the cold and thick fog, had filled him with a deep respect. He looked down at the dog, saw its shivering body beneath its dirt-caked fur, and thought to himself, if he's alive, you'll be a hero, Shadow. But he didn't dare to hope for too much. 2 days in the cold and waterless crevice was a trial few could endure, even for a soldier as tough as Dan. Dan lay in the sweltering darkness below the crevice, his body almost motionless, his breathing so weak it was almost inaudible. He had lost track of time, and the cold of about -1 degree Celsius 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the crevice, though colder than outside, was still draining him. The pain from his broken right leg and the gash on his forehead were now only vague sensations, as if his body had become numb to the pain. Sweat no longer flowed because he was severely dehydrated, and his brown eyes were half closed, blurred in the darkness. He survived by a small gap between the rock and the ground, where mist seeped in, carrying moisture from the surface air. He licked the drops of water from the rock, drinking weakly to keep his body from becoming completely dehydrated, but he had no strength left to eat or move. In his daze, he thought of Shadow, remembered the dog's bright eyes whenever he looked at him, and whispered to himself with the last of his strength, Shadow, if you're still there, find me. But he had no strength left to hope for more. On the ground, the rescue team finally broke through the damp red dirt that covered the entrance to the ravine after more than an hour of nonstop work. Sweat streamed down their faces, seeping through their olive-green uniforms, and red dirt covered their arms and shoulders, but no one complained. They widened the narrow opening into an entrance large enough for one man to climb down, and Reynolds bent down, shining a high-powered flashlight inside. The light from the flashlight illuminated Dan's pale face, highlighting the dried blood on his forehead and his dry, cracked lips. He lay there, motionless, his eyes half closed, his breathing barely visible, his right leg bent at an awkward angle, and his left arm hanging limply in the damp dirt. Reynolds felt his heart sink. He wasn't sure if Dan was alive, but he wouldn't give up. We found him. Hurry, he shouted to the team, quickly getting into position, preparing to lift Dan to the surface. Corporal Chris Evans and Medic Paul, a man in his mid-30s with short black hair and strong arms, volunteered to climb down the ravine to check on Dan. Evans climbed down first, his hands shaking from the cold as he clung to the roots and the slippery red soil in the ravine. He knelt down next to Dan, placing his hand on his neck to check his pulse. His pulse was weak, but still beating, a fragile sign of life. He felt a surge of hope, but he also knew that Dan was in dire straits. He looked at his pale face, saw his dry lips and half-closed eyes, and felt a pang of pain. He had patrolled with Dan, knew him to be a patient soldier who kept his cool in difficult situations, and he whispered to himself, "You have to live, Dan. Shadow didn't abandon you, and neither will we." Paul, who climbed down after Evans, carried a thermal blanket and a small medical kit. He checked Dan's breathing, placed his hand on his chest to feel for him, and confirmed that he was alive, though weak. "He's severely dehydrated," he told Evans, "and his leg is badly broken. We need to get him out now." Evans and Paul carefully placed Dan on a stretcher, strapping him in with straps to avoid further injury. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, trying to protect his body from the cold while the rescue team above pulled the stretcher up. When Dan was pulled to the surface, the pale sunlight shone on his pale face, highlighting the dried blood and cracked skin from dehydration. The rescue team breathed a sigh of relief to see him alive, a miracle after 2 days trapped in the cold, foggy crevices of the Blue Ridge. Shadow, exhausted, trudged over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff Dan's face. His red eyes lit up faintly but hopefully, as if he knew Dan had been saved. Shadow had no strength left to bark, but he put his head on Dan's hand, felt the faint warmth of his body, and stood still beside him, as if to make sure he was still alive. Reynolds watched the scene, feeling a surge of emotion. He knelt down beside Shadow, stroking the dog's muddy fur, and felt its trembling body beneath his hand. He knew that without Shadow, they would never have found Dan in time. He thought to himself, "You did the unthinkable, Shadow." Evans, standing next to Reynolds, wiped the water from his face, not to clean it, but to hide the tears of emotion. He looked at Shadow, saw its emaciated body, its trembling legs, and its bleeding claws, and knew that the dog had sacrificed everything to save Dan. He whispered to himself, "Thank you, Shadow. You are a true hero." The rescue team quickly gave Dan first aid on the spot. Paul put him on in 4, pumping him with warm saline to help his body fight dehydration. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had a broken right leg and a deep laceration on his forehead, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his right leg for temporary immobilization and wrapped an additional thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the bitter cold. Dan was still unconscious, but his breathing was steadying, and his pulse was becoming more palpable thanks to the saline. The rescue team knew they needed to get him back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. As the rescue team prepared to load Dan into the jeep for the trip back to base, Shadow struggled to his feet and follow. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, claws leaving small trails of blood in the dirt. He didn't have the strength to walk fast, but he tried anyway, as if he didn't want to leave Dan's side for even a second. Sarah and Gwen, standing nearby, pulled an old coat from her pack, an olive green military jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and wrapped it around Shadow to protect him from the cold. She stroked the dog's head, feeling the dirt-caked fur beneath her hands, and saw his red eyes looking at her with determination. She knew Shadow needed medical attention, but she also knew he wouldn't leave Dan until he was safe. "Put Shadow in a jeep next to Dan," Reynolds ordered the team. "He's done enough. We'll take care of both of them." Paul and another member of the rescue team, Private First Class Tom Brooks, a 30-year-old man with short red hair and a calm demeanor, carefully picked up Shadow and placed him in the jeep next to Dan's stretcher. Shadow didn't protest. He was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Sarah's coat tighter around him and placed a small blanket over him to protect him from the cold wind coming through the car door. Shadow lay close to Dan, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes watching him with determination. He didn't have the strength to bark or move, but he was there next to Dan, as if to make sure he was safe. Dan, still unconscious, had a vague feeling in his heart. He didn't know that the rescue team had found him, didn't know that Shadow had stood guard for 2 days to lead them here. But in his faint dreams, he saw Shadow, his eyes glowing, standing in the misty mountains, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew the dog would never abandon him. That miraculous moment, when Dan was pulled from the narrow passage, alive after 2 days trapped in the cold and fog, was not only a miracle of survival, but also a testament to the unwavering loyalty of Shadow, the German shepherd who refused to abandon his companion. As the rescue team from a makeshift base camp near Blue Ridge pulled Dan Harper from a narrow ravine deep in the mountains, the damp chill of Tuesday morning was still in the air on the 3rd day since he went missing. The temperature hovered around 1 degree Celsius 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light breeze blew through the area, carrying moisture from the wet red soil that clung to the green and yellow pine trees. Dan lay unconscious on a stretcher, his face pale with streaks of dried blood on his forehead, his lips cracked from dehydration, and his weak breaths came in thin wisps that dissipated in the chill air. The rescue team quickly wrapped him in a silver thermal blanket, administered fluids through and for to combat his severe dehydration, and immobilized his broken right leg with a hard plastic pad and medical tape. But as they worked, Shadow, the German shepherd who had stood guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days, creeped closer, never leaving Dan's side. Shadow was now a shadow of his former self. His jet-black fur, once carefully groomed against the chill of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was matted with red dirt and dry pine needles, matted in dry, crusty patches, revealing a thin, shivering body beneath. Shadow's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red from frost, cold, and exhaustion. His legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches he had made from scratching the damp red dirt for 2 days straight, leaving small red streaks on the ground. Shadow had no strength left to walk fast, but he trudged closer to Dan's stretcher, bending down to sniff his face, as if to make sure he was still alive. As the rescue team laid Dan down to bandage him and prepare him for the jeep, Shadow lay close to the stretcher, using his body to shield Dan from the cold winds that blew through the area. The rescue team looked at Shadow with awe and emotion. Captain Mark Reynolds, the team leader, stood nearby, watching the dog with awe in his piercing blue eyes. Reynolds, a 40-year-old man with short gray hair and a lean face tanned by long hours in the outdoors, had seen much in his military career, from dangerous patrols to inevitable loss. He was not an emotional man, but the sight of Shadow lying so close to Dan, using his thin body to shield him, made him feel a pang of pain. He looked at the dog's trembling body, saw the dirt on his fur and the dried blood on his claws, and knew that Shadow had sacrificed everything to save Dan. No food, no water, no rest for 2 days in the cold and thick fog. He knelt beside Shadow, stroked his dirt-matted fur, felt the thin, trembling body beneath his hands. "You did what none of us could," he thought. "You're a real warrior." Corporal Chris Evans, a member of the rescue team, stood next to Reynolds, looking at Shadow with thoughtful eyes. Evans, a tall 29-year-old with dark brown hair and a tan, had patrolled with Dan and Shadow on many missions in the Blue Ridge. He knew the bond between them, and he felt a deep emotion when he saw Shadow lying close to Dan, using his body to shield him from the cold wind. He knelt down next to Shadow, took an old coat from his pack, an olive green military jacket, frayed at the cuffs and soaked with sweat from days of patrol, and wrapped it around the dog's body to protect him from the cold and the damp red soil. He stroked Shadow's head, felt the dirt-caked fur beneath his hand, and saw its red eyes looking at him with determination. "You did everything to save him, Shadow. Now it's our turn to take care of you," he whispered to himself. While the rescue team bandaged Dan, Shadow did not move from his position. The dog lay close to the stretcher, his body pressed tightly against the edge of the stretcher, like a living wall separating Dan from the cold wind blowing through the area. Shadow's legs trembled. The strong muscles that had once made him run like the wind on the trails around the base now shrunk from the cold and lack of water. He no longer had the strength to stand, but he still tried, using his last bit of strength to protect Dan. The rescue team saw this action, and a feeling of admiration welled up in their hearts. Paul, the team's medical officer, a man of about 35 years old with short black hair and strong hands, was bandaging Dan's right leg and looked up at Shadow. He shook his head in amazement, thinking to himself, "I've never seen a dog like this." Not only did he save him, but he protected him to the very end. Dan, still unconscious, did not know that Shadow was beside him, protecting him from the cold and wind of the deep mountains. He did not feel the faint warmth of Shadow's thin body, did not hear the dog's panting as it struggled to keep its position. But in his hazy dream, he saw Shadow, his eyes shining, standing in the misty depths of the mountains, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew that the dog would never abandon him. In his heart, though he could not consciously realize it, a warm feeling crept into his mind, as if he knew that he was not alone. The rescue team finished bandaging Dan, securing his right leg with a makeshift splint made of hard plastic and medical tape, and wrapping a layer of thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the harsh cold. They checked his breathing and pulse, finding them to be slightly more stable, thanks to the warm saline solution being administered intravenously. But they knew that Dan needed to be taken back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. They loaded Dan into a military jeep, a vehicle designed for the rugged terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains, with olive green paint and large tires designed to traverse trails covered in red dirt and loose rocks. The vehicle was covered with a blue tarp to protect it from the wind and cold, and Dan was placed on a soft mattress to minimize the vibrations during the ride. As the rescue team prepared to leave, Shadow struggled to get up and follow Dan. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, claws leaving small trails of blood in the red dirt. He had no strength to walk fast, but he tried, as if he didn't want to leave Dan's side for even a second. Sarah Nguyen, a member of the team, looked at Shadow with tears in her eyes. She knew Shadow needed immediate medical attention, but she also knew he wouldn't leave Dan until he was safe. She knelt down next to Shadow, stroked his head, and said to Reynolds, "We need to take Shadow with us. He can't stay here." Reynolds nodded, ordering the team, "Put Shadow in the jeep next to Dan. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Paul and Private First Class Tom Brooks, a 30-year-old man with short red hair and a calm demeanor, carefully lifted Shadow and placed him in the Jeep next to Dan's stretcher. Shadow didn't protest. He was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Evans's jacket tighter around him and placed a small blanket over him to protect him from the cold wind coming through the door. Shadow lay close to Dan, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes looking at him with determination. It had no strength left to bark or move, but it was there, next to Dan, as if to make sure he was safe. The rescue team set off, the Jeep moving over rough trails, heading for the base camp 8 miles away, where a medical team was waiting to take Dan and Shadow. The cold wind still blew, carrying moisture that clung to the canvas of the vehicle, but inside, Shadow lay close to Dan, its thin body radiating a faint warmth. Reynolds sat in the front, looking back at Shadow and Dan, feeling a surge of emotion. He knew that Shadow's protective actions were more than instinct. They were loyalty beyond measure, a deep friendship between a dog and its owner. If he's alive, it's because of you, Shadow, he thought. Sarah sat next to Shadow, stroking his head, feeling his weak breathing under her hand. She looked at Dan, saw his pale face regaining some color from the saline solution, and hoped that he would wake up. She looked at Shadow, saw his red eyes still looking at Dan, and she knew that the dog had done all he could. "Thank you, Shadow," she whispered to herself. "You saved him, and we will save you." As the Jeep moved through the deep Blue Ridge Mountains, Shadow lay there, next to Dan, a living testament to loyalty and friendship that had endured the test of cold, fog, and danger. Evans, who sat in the back of the Jeep, felt a surge of gratitude as he looked at Shadow. He thought of the patrols in the Blue Ridge, when Shadow had always been ahead of the team, his nose sniffing the ground, his ears pricked for danger. He remembered the times Dan threw the rubber ball to Shadow, and the way the dog ran with a joy rarely seen in a working dog. He knew that Shadow had not only saved Dan, he had saved the team's morale, bringing hope to a seemingly hopeless situation. He whispered to himself, "You're more than a dog, Shadow. You're our family." As the Jeep continued to roll through the red dirt trails, the weak morning sunlight filtered through the pine trees, brightening the lingering fog in the air. Shadow lay there, his lean body almost motionless, but his eyes never left Dan, as if to say that his mission wasn't over until Dan was safe. Little did the rescuers know that this journey was not just the end of a search. It was the beginning of a greater discovery, a secret hidden in the mist that Shadow would lead them to in the days to come. But right now, in that moment, all they saw was the unwavering loyalty of Shadow, a German shepherd who used his own life force to protect the companion he loved. After being pulled from a narrow ravine deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains by rescuers, Daniel, Dan Harper, and Shadow were loaded into a military jeep and driven 8 miles to a makeshift base camp. The chill of the January morning still hung over the area, with temperatures around 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius, and a light breeze blew, carrying moisture from the red dirt that clung to the vehicle's olive-green tarpaulin. Dan lay unconscious on the stretcher, his face pale with streaks of dried blood on his forehead, his lips dry and cracked, and his broken right leg temporarily immobilized with a plastic pad. And 4 was hooked up to his arm, dripping warm saline solution to counteract his severe dehydration. Shadow lay next to the stretcher, his thin body trembling, his jet-black fur streaked with brown from dirt and dried leaves, his red eyes fixed on Dan with determination. The rescue team, led by Captain Mark Reynolds, sat around them, eyes a mixture of worry and hope as the vehicle rolled over the rough trails toward the base. The journey back to the base took about 25 minutes, and when the Jeep pulled into the base yard, a large area surrounded by wire mesh fencing and lush pine forests, a medical team was waiting. Dan was quickly ushered into the base's medical shack, a small corrugated iron-roofed room with wooden walls, containing a few medical beds, a medicine cabinet, and a small heater to alleviate the chill outside. Nurses in olive green uniforms began to assess his condition, diagnosing him with severe dehydration, a broken right leg, and a deep laceration on his forehead. His skin was pale, his breathing was shallow, and his body was shivering despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. They gave him more saline intravenously, put him under a heating lamp to warm him up, and took x-rays with a handheld machine to determine the extent of the damage to his leg. The base doctors decided he needed to be transported to a larger military hospital for treatment, and a U-860 Black Hawk helicopter was called to take him to the military hospital in Asheville, about 50 miles away. Shadow, meanwhile, was taken to a separate area on the base reserved for working animals. A veterinarian named Karen, a woman in her mid-30s with dark brown hair tied back and soft blue eyes, checked on the dog. Shadow weighed about 72 pounds, nearly 10 pounds less than before the accident, having not eaten or drank anything for 2 days in the cold and fog. Its jet black fur was matted with red dirt and dried leaves. Its eyes were red, and its claws were bleeding from deep scratches. Karen checked Shadow's heart rate and breathing, which were weak but steady, and confirmed that the dog was severely weakened by hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. She gave Shadow fluids through and for, pumped him with a nutrient solution to replenish his energy, and placed him under a heat lamp to keep him warm in the cool shed. She bandaged the scratches on Shadow's claws and gently trimmed away the matted fur to clean his body. But Karen noticed that Shadow's eyes kept darting toward the medical shed, as if searching for Dan. The flight from Blue Ridge to Asheville took about 20 minutes. Dan was placed on a stretcher in the helicopter's cockpit, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with a small oxygen tube attached to his nose to help him breathe. Shadow was placed in a metal cage next to him, his thin body lying on a soft mattress, his red eyes peering through the metal bars to watch Dan. The helicopter lifted off into the dim morning light, the roar of the engine drowning out all other sounds, and as they flew over pine forests and low mountains, the chill of the Blue Ridge gradually gave way to the warmer air of the plains near Asheville. When the helicopter landed at the military hospital in Asheville in mid-morning, the temperature was about 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, a welcome change from the cold, deep mountains Dan and Shadow had just left. At the military hospital in Asheville, Dan was admitted to the intensive care unit. He was placed on a medical bed with a metal railing, in a small room with white walls, frosted glass windows overlooking a small garden, and modern medical equipment such as a heart monitor and a backup ventilator. Doctors diagnosed him with severe dehydration, a fracture in his right leg, and a laceration on his forehead that required stitches. They performed minor surgery to stabilize his leg with a metal rod and splint, and stitched up the laceration on his forehead with 8 surgical stitches. An oxygen tube was placed in his nose, and an 4 drip hung from a metal rack next to the bed, providing nutrients and pain medication. For the first 2 days, Dan remained unconscious, his body so weak that doctors feared the damage from dehydration might be affecting his brain, but they hoped he would wake up as his body recovered. Shadow was cared for in an animal ward in the hospital, about 50 feet from Dan's room. Karen, the veterinarian from the base, accompanied the flight to continue monitoring the dog's condition. Shadow was placed on a soft cushion examination table in a small room with white walls and a clean tile floor. Karen administered 4 fluids to Shadow, feeding him small meals of soft, protein-rich foods like ground beef mixed with rice to help him regain his strength. She cleaned Shadow's matted fur with warm water and mild soap, bandaged the scratches on his claws, and placed him under a heat lamp to keep him warm in the cool Asheville air. Shadow recovered, his body stopped shaking, and his red eyes began to shine brighter, but his gaze kept darting toward the door, as if waiting for Dan. On the second day in the hospital, Dan began to show signs of waking up. He opened his eyes slowly, the white light from the ceiling shining into his eyes, causing him to blink repeatedly to adjust. He felt a dull ache in his right leg and forehead, but the pain was not as intense as before. He looked around, seeing the white walls, the medical bed, and the 4 hanging beside it. He couldn't remember what had happened, only vague images of the cold wind, the suffocating cold in the crevice, and Shadow's eyes in his mind. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak, and a young nurse named Lily, a girl of about 22 with brown hair tied back and soft blue eyes, quickly came over, placing her hands on his shoulders to keep him down. She told him in a gentle voice that he was saved, that he was in the hospital in Asheville, and that he needed to rest. Dan didn't say anything, but in his mind a single question appeared: where is Shadow? When Dan woke up, the rescue team informed Karen, and she decided to take Shadow to his room. Shadow, though still weak, had regained some of his strength under Karen's care. His fur had been cleaned, the scratches on his claws had been bandaged, and his thin body was no longer shaking. Karen led Shadow on a leash through the long hallways of the hospital, with its white tile floors and the smell of antiseptic in the air, to Dan's room. When the door opened, Shadow saw Dan lying on the bed, and his brown eyes lit up weakly but hopefully. The dog shuffled over to the bed, pulling on a leash in Karen's hand, and placed his head on Dan's hand. Dan looked down, saw Shadow, and felt a surge of emotion. He reached out to stroke Shadow's head, feeling the soft fur under his hand, and whispered to himself, "You saved me, Shadow. Thank you." From then on, Shadow stayed with Dan throughout his hospital stay. The nurses set up a small mat in the corner of the room for Shadow, and the dog lay there, never leaving Dan's side. Every day, Karen came to check on Shadow, feeding him small meals and changing the bandages on his claws. Shadow gradually regained his strength, his fur began to shine again, and his skinny body gradually filled out. But his eyes never left Dan. Whenever a stranger entered the room, Shadow stood up, ears perked up, as if to protect him. Dan, meanwhile, recovered slowly. He underwent physical therapy to regain strength in his right leg, and although the wound on his forehead had healed, he still felt a dull ache when he moved. He was still weak, but every day he felt better and he knew that he was alive because of Shadow. Dan thought about what had happened during his days in the hospital. He remembered the cold wind, the stifling cold in the crevice, and the despair of knowing he would never escape. He remembered the faint dreams of Shadow, the dog's bright eyes in the misty depths of the mountains. He didn't know exactly what Shadow had done to save him, but he felt the dog's loyalty in every moment. He looked at Shadow, saw the dog lying on the rug in the corner of the room, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. "I owe you my life, Shadow," he whispered to himself. "I will never forget that." The story of Dan and Shadow spread through the military hospital in Asheville and then to their unit near Blue Ridge. The nurses said that Shadow never left Dan's side, that the dog stood up whenever a stranger entered the room, as if to protect him. The doctors said that Dan's survival was a miracle, that he had surpassed the limits of the human body because of Shadow's will and loyalty. Reynolds, Evans, and the other rescuers visited Dan when they were transferred to Asheville to report, bringing greetings and admiration. They told him of Shadow's loyalty, how he had stood guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days, leading them to him to save him. Dan listened, his eyes filling with tears, and he stroked Shadow's head, feeling the warmth of his body beneath his hands. After 3 weeks in the hospital, Dan was discharged. He still needed crutches for a few days to help him walk because his right leg was not fully healed, but he was well enough to leave Asheville. Shadow, now stronger, walked beside him, his black fur slicked back with a hint of brown, his ears erect, and his eyes as bright as ever. He left the hospital with a deep sense of gratitude, not just for being alive, but for having Shadow by his side, the companion who had not abandoned him in his hour of need. He knew that his journey of recovery was not just physical, but also spiritual, and Shadow helped him find meaning in life again. After 3 weeks of treatment at the military hospital in Asheville, Daniel Dan Harper was discharged on a mid-February morning in 2025. The air in Asheville was cool, with a temperature of about 5 degrees Celsius 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light breeze carrying the scent of dry earth from the nearby fields blew across the military parking lot. Dan walked out of the hospital building, using crutches on his right arm for the first few days to help him move, his right leg still weak from the surgery to stabilize the bone. He wore a new olive green military jacket given to him by Chris Evans, a thick gray sweater and dark blue jeans. His face was still pale, with a faint scar on his forehead from a healed laceration, but his brown eyes were brighter, shining with a determination and gratitude he had never had before. Beside him, Shadow walked slowly, his jet black fur with a hint of brown restored by the days of care at the hospital. The 82-pound German Shepherd was now strong, with erect ears and bright brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and loyalty. Shadow stayed by Dan's side, never leaving his side, as if knowing that his mission to protect him was not over. Dan decided not to return to the Blue Ridge Mountains or to continue his military career. After the tragedy in the cold wind and dense fog, he realized that his life needed a new direction, one that was not only for himself, but also for Shadow, the companion who would save his life. He applied for early retirement from the military, citing his health as no longer fit for service, and was granted it after doctors determined that his right leg injury, though partially healed, would leave him permanently disabled, preventing him from patrolling or performing physically demanding tasks. He felt no regrets. The military had given him a purpose over the years, but Shadow had given him a reason to live. He packed his belongings from the base near Blue Ridge his comrades had sent into Asheville after the incident, including his father's old backpack, his small folding knife, and the small notebook he'd used to jot down his scattered thoughts, and headed back to Black Mountain, North Carolina, where the family cabin was waiting for him. The journey from Asheville to Black Mountain took about 30 minutes, all by car, because Dan didn't want Shadow to endure another flight in a transport cage. He rented a gray Ford Escape in Asheville, put Shadow in a passenger seat, and drove back home through winding roads between pine forests and low mountains that had lost most of their leaves for winter. Shadow sat still, his head resting on the seat, his eyes half closed but alert to any sounds outside. Dan stopped once along the way at a small rest stop, bought a bottle of water and a sandwich for himself, and took some dry food from his pack to give to Shadow. At each stop, Shadow got out of the car and walked beside him, ears pricked as if to make sure he was safe. When they reached Black Mountain in the middle of the afternoon, the cool country air greeted them, with temperatures around 4 degrees Celsius 39 degrees Fahrenheit and pale sunlight filtering through the clouds, illuminating the familiar dirt roads. Dan drove through the winding roads of Black Mountain, past bare pine forests and small wooden houses dotted along the road. He stopped in front of his family's old wooden house, a one-story house with a gray-tiled roof, wood walls faded with age, and an old fireplace in the living room that he had not repaired since his parents died. The house was just as he remembered it, with a peeling white front door, a small front porch where his mother had placed pots of spring flowers, and a small yard in the back covered with dry pine needles from nearby trees. He stepped out of the car, leaning on his crutches, feeling the winter chill seep through his coat, and looked at the house with a sense of both familiarity and alienation. Shadow jumped out after him, standing close by, sniffing the air with his ears pricked up, as if checking everything around him for Dan's safety. Dan opened the door to the house, stepped inside, and smelled the old wooden air, mixed with the dampness of the months of uninhabitation. The living room was the same as before, with a worn gray cloth armchair, a wooden table his father had built himself, and an old, dusty fireplace. He put his father's backpack on the table, took out a family photo of the small stream near the house, a keepsake he always carried with him, and placed it on the wooden shelf next to the fireplace. He sat down in the armchair, feeling his body tired but relieved, and watched a shadow lay down next to him on the wooden floor, his head resting on his paws, his eyes shining as if to say he would always be there. He stroked Shadow's head, feeling the soft fur under his hand, and thought to himself, "I'm home, Shadow. Thank you for bringing me home." Dan decided to use his savings from his time in the military to renovate the cabin on Black Mountain, rather than sell it. He wanted to make it a place where he and Shadow could live peacefully, not just as a memory of the past, but as a new beginning. He called an old friend from Black Mountain, Ben, a 36-year-old carpenter who had worked with his father, to help him with the repairs. Ben, with dark hair and rough hands like Dan's father, came over one afternoon, bringing tools anew to replace rotten floorboards and repair the roof. They worked together for several weeks, painting the walls white, replacing leaky tiles, and building a low wooden fence around a backyard to give Shadow room to run around. Dan and Shadow moved into the house completely in late February, when the pine forests around Black Mountain were covered with a thin layer of winter fog, and the afternoon sun filtered through the bare trees, brightening their small yard. Every afternoon, Dan and Shadow walked the dirt roads around Black Mountain. Dan gave up his crutches after a few days as his right leg healed through physical therapy at a small clinic in town, though he still felt stiff with every movement. He walked slowly, taking in the crisp winter air, the scent of dry earth and pine needles filling his nostrils. Shadow walked beside him, ears perked, eyes bright, occasionally running a few steps ahead to sniff the grass along the road or chase a small bird that flew by. Dan looked at Shadow, feeling a peace he had never known before. He thought of his days in the Blue Ridge, of the cold patrols in the deep mountains, of the cold wind that had nearly taken his life, and how Shadow had stood guard at the edge of a ravine for 2 days to save him. He knew he would never forget Shadow's loyalty, and he decided to spend the rest of his life caring for the dog, a friend who had not abandoned him in his hour of need. But Dan and Shadow's story doesn't end there. A week after Dan was discharged from the hospital, a rescue team from a base near Blue Ridge returned to the canyon to investigate further, based on reports from a group of locals who had heard Shadow barking. Led by Captain Reynolds, they discovered a secret hidden in the mist, the wreckage of a missing military aircraft, a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter, lying about 300 meters away from the canyon, shrouded in fog and dense vegetation. The helicopter had crashed during a storm earlier, and the faint signal from its dead engine had gone undetected by humans. But Shadow, with his keen hearing, seemed to have heard a strange screech from the wreckage, a sound that Dan had also vaguely sensed in his dreamy state below the canyon. It was that call, combined with Shadow's loyalty to Dan, that kept the dog from leaving the area, leading the rescue team not only to Dan, but to this discovery. The story of Dan, Shadow, and the secret of the plane spread through the local community in Black Mountain and Dan's old military unit near Blue Ridge. Neighbors in Black Mountain who had known Dan since he was a child came to visit him, bringing gifts like homemade pies and local coffee. They sat in his yard, listening to him tell the story of Shadow, of the dog's loyalty that saved his life and revealed the secret in the mist. They watched Shadow, now healthy and happy, run around a yard, and felt a deep sense of. At Blue Ridge, Reynolds, Evans, and other members of the rescue team told the story to new recruits, turning Dan and Shadow into symbols of loyalty and acumen within the unit. They honored Shadow not only for saving Dan, but also for leading them to the wreckage, a discovery that solved the mystery and brought closure to the families of the crew. Shadow, now 5 years old, lived happily with Dan in the cabin in Black Mountain. The dog no longer had to face the harsh cold of the deep mountains or the dangers of fog and rugged terrain. Instead, he lived a peaceful life, running around in the yard, lying on the porch while Dan read on an old wooden chair, and walking with him on the red dirt roads. Dan cared for Shadow with all his love and gratitude, feeding him nutritious meals like ground beef mixed with rice, taking him to the veterinarian in Black Mountain regularly, and petting his head every night before bed. He looked at Shadow, saw the light in his eyes, and felt that he had found the true meaning of life not in the military missions or the months of running away from Black Mountain, but in the deep friendship with Shadow. For Dan, the tragedy in the Blue Ridge Mountains was not just a painful memory, but also a profound lesson. He learned that loyalty can transcend all boundaries, that the friendship between humans and animals is a lasting, precious bond. He learned that sensitivity and perseverance can lead to unexpected discoveries, like how Shadow heard a call in the fog and led the rescue team to the plane wreckage. And he learned that four-legged friends like Shadow deserve to be loved and cared for, not just because of what they do for us, but because they are a part of our lives. Every time he looked at Shadow, Dan whispered to himself, "Thank you, Shadow. I will never forget what you did for me." Dan and Shadow's story ended in peace and happiness, but the lesson from it remained forever. It was a lesson about Shadow's absolute loyalty, when the dog did not abandon Dan in the face of cold, thirst, and danger. It's a lesson in enduring friendship, as Dan and Shadow's relationship overcomes all odds to become a living testament to the bond between humans and animals. It's a lesson in the resilience that leads to discovery, as Shadow not only saves Dan's life but also reveals the secret of the missing plane. And it's a lesson in appreciating four-legged friends, as Shadow uses his own life force to protect Dan and bring hope to the rescue team. Dan and Shadow live together in a cabin in Black Mountain, a testament to friendship that transcends all boundaries, a story that four-legged loyalty will forever tell to honor loyal dogs like Shadow.